Buddy. We'll be doing that right now. And with that, I'm really happy to introduce Andrew Bingham with U of I Extension, and he's going to be your presenter today, and he's going to go ahead and let you know a little bit about his background. So thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm going to get my PowerPoint up here. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's class. I have taught this a few times with NKA. It's been a few years, but this is also my first time doing it virtually. I was not going to lie, a little disappointed that we're still doing this on Zoom. Hopefully next time we're together and we can talk about these things in person, but at least we have the opportunity to do it still, right? So today's presentation is titled Who Gets Grandma's Yellow Pie Plate? It was actually developed by a extension educator out of University of Minnesota. I've taken her material and I've adapted it. But if you also have the manual, this is also written by University of Minnesota. And you can follow along or you can fill it out afterwards. It's up to you. I won't be referencing it too much, so you won't be missing out if you don't have it on hand at the current moment. So we'll go ahead and dive into introductions. And when I mean introductions, I mean me. I'm going to talk about myself for the first slide. My name's Andrew Bingham. That was my profile picture. I always like to show off my family, though, any opportunity I can. This is my wife and 3 kids. Picture was taken on Sunday because that's about the only time I update my family picture is on Easter. 3 young kids, they keep us busy. Prior to having those kids, though, I attended university, sorry, getting ahead of myself. I am a financial educator for the University of Idaho. To get there, I got a degree from BYU Idaho, and then went on to get a degree from University of Utah. So my bachelor's is in financial economics, my master's is in finance. We did not want to live in Eastern Idaho or Utah, so we moved back home to the Valley here. My wife and I both grew up in the Boise Valley, started looking for a job. And sure enough, we found one with the University of Idaho Extension. My interests include anything with spreadsheets and finance. So as you can imagine, this position teaching finance for the University of Idaho was a pretty good fit. But outside of those, I do enjoy football or really anything sports. So my news feed, if you're to look at like my Yahoo News or Google feed, whatever, would be full of, finance, some current events, and a lot of sports articles. So with that, we'll go ahead and dive right into our topic today. And I like to start off with a fun little GIF. What you talking about? Well, we're talking about wills. Of course, referring back to Gary Coleman, what you talking about, Willis? One of the downsides of doing it on Zoom is I don't know if anybody's laughing or appreciates this. I will say the very first time that I presented this, it was in our classroom here at the Ada County Extension Office, and I got some chuckles. So I'm just going to assume that everyone's chuckling at least a little bit and appreciates my dad's sense of humor. So some time ago, and I say some time ago because COVID happened for the last 2 years, and so that kind of throws everybody's timeline off. But pre-COVID, there was a survey going out, and it was asking these individuals, do you have a will or a living trust? And so I want to put this question out to the group, just throw out some guesses, but what percentage of adults do not have a will or living trust? And so when I say adults, that means 18 years and up. So from 18 all the way to 90, 101, however old. What percentage do you think do not have a will or a living trust? All right, 70, 75, 55. We'll take a few more. Just type it in the chat. If you don't know how, there's a little speaking box icon at the bottom of your bar on Zoom. You can just click that, and in the bar that says type message here, just toss in a number. All right, we'll give everyone about 30 more seconds to do that. All right, 89%. And really, those are all pretty good guesses. About 60% of adults do not have a will or a living trust. And so that's pretty impressive. Like, considering that millennials, somewhere in the range of, late 20s to early 40s, probably aren't too concerned about wills and living trusts. And, that doesn't even mention the Gen Z. But considering that those are included in this portion of the poll, I'm actually quite impressed that it's only 60%. I would have guessed with everyone else that it was much higher. So Karen, I guess you win 5 points for getting the closest, 5% off. All right. So what percentage of baby boomers, and this is ages 53 to 71, do you think do not have a will or a living trust? So we're getting into the age here. And again, just type this into the chat box. Just throw out a guess. It's just kind of fun to see how close we can get. So once we get to baby boomer age, ages 53 to 71, we're in that range where we should be considering wills or living trusts. And we'll talk about the difference between those at the end of this presentation. So we got 40, we got 15%, we got 20. Any other guesses? Now, I think we could reasonably expect the number is going to be lower, right? Because the older you get, the more of these people or this demographic should have wills and living trusts. So the answer is 42. 42% of baby boomers do not have a will or a living trust. So they don't have a plan in place. So most do, fortunately. And last but not least, what percentage of seniors do not have a will or a living trust? And this is ages 72 and up. So go ahead and toss your guesses into the chat box again. All right, 25%, 15%. Going with nice round numbers, divisible by 5. And 10%. All right, you're all in the ballpark at least. The answer is that 19% of seniors do not have a will or a living trust. So that means 80% do, 81%. So you might be thinking, well, most of seniors do and most baby boomers do, then what's the point of today's presentation? So my goal today isn't to convince you to establish a will or a living trust. Basically, the goal of today's presentation is to get you to consider a lot of things that get overlooked when it comes to estate planning. Honestly, I teach finance. I'm a numbers guy. I'm a facts guy. I like to get technical. But today's presentation isn't super technical. It's actually a lot of psychological. We talk about factors that need to go into consideration. We talked about conflict, how to manage that conflict and everything. In fact, I'm getting ahead of myself because we will have a slide here shortly where we will talk about the aspects that we'll be covering today. So we're going to start off talking about challenges of estate planning. So there are two different kinds of challenges. There's the unique challenges and there are the common challenges. So unique challenges would include things like in-law consideration. So if you have kids and your kids have spouses, where do they fit into the estate planning process? Stepchildren. So if your children married someone who already had kids from a previous marriage, that can make things complicated, and that is a unique challenge. Past family strain. Every family is different, so there could be a story ranging from simple to very dramatic and extreme that can play a role when it comes to planning. Family secrets kind of falling in line with that last bit there. And then there's the more common challenges that you may face when planning a will or a living trust. So There's the realization of losing loved ones. This can go both ways. It could be the planner is hesitant or even refuses to make the plan because they don't want to face their own mortality or don't want to think about what the family operate like once they're gone. Or it could even happen on the children or the beneficiaries portion when they don't really want to think about life without mom or dad or whatever family member. Miscommunication. I really don't feel like I need to expand on that at all. Miscommunication is a common problem in a lot of individuals' lives, so you can imagine how it would play a role of mucking things up for estate planning. Ignorance. So there are a lot of laws, a lot of technicalities that go into estate planning. So overlooking one of those is not difficult to do. But then there's also just ignorance about family issues, as I mentioned, the planning portion too. So, divide my possessions equally. Is it a good solution? So, just in the chat box, who has heard this plan before? Who has dealt with this plan before? Who thinks it's a good idea? So I just think it's asked like 3 questions. So let's take a step back. Who thinks divide my possessions equally is a reasonable idea or plan when it comes to leaving your goods behind? Yes, no. Kathy has a thumbs up. Has anyone seen anything like this that's kind of blown up in their face or it's worked out really well? John's saying depends. Joan is saying no. And honestly, it's not a great question because there is no right or wrong answer, right? Is it a good solution? Well, it depends. You're right, John. You're also right, Joan, because it does work for titled property, right? Things that are very large, very valuable, those can be split more evenly. So houses, land, vehicles, boats, and other large assets. You can take those, divide those possessions equally, or sell it and then divide it equally. And I think everyone, all things being equal, would be okay with that. But does it work for everything? And when I say everything, what about that non-titled property? So when I say non-titled property, and again, use the chat box, and I guess you can also unmute and just answer this out loud, but what are some non-titled property that is valuable to your family if you feel like sharing? So you can type in the chat box or unmute and share it verbally. Farmland. All right. So, and everyone continue to type in answers into the chat box, but I'll talk a little bit to this farmland. I actually help out with some ag colleagues who do farming succession series. It's a 6-course series that we meet over 6 weeks. And yeah, you want to talk about complicated. Once you throw a family farm into the mix, things get really difficult and hairy when it comes to estate planning. So sports stuff, hunting stuff, jewelry, great examples. I'm going to share a few of mine here in a little bit. Guns. Yeah. My dad has a lot of guns. In fact, he's trying to get ahead of the curve and just start distributing them now. He's 68, I think, 67, 68. I'm not a huge gun person, but he did feel it was, necessary to leave guns to all his sons and son-in-law. And I ended up with a gun that he received from my great-grandfather, who was actually my namesake. My middle name's Gordon, so I got my Grandpa Gordon's gun. Sits under my bed. I haven't shot it. It's from 1920s, but yeah, it's kind of cool because it's sentimental, right? All right, so considerations of mental condition and needs of one child over another. So yes, and we'll talk about those considerations when we get to the equal and fair slide. So some examples, and again, this is where I'm going to get a little bit personal, is Grandpa's belt buckle. My dad has a belt buckle that has his dad's name on it, and I guess his name, which is Cal, although he goes by his middle name. And it's pretty ornate. It's got, you know, some fine jewelry in it, and also has like elk teeth, which is ivory. That's something that I don't think we're going to fight over because none of my kids are named Cal, so that one kind of has a built-in solution. But Dad's coins. Dad is into collecting coins. My dad is, and so that's a pretty neat thing that he has the ability to pass down. And the family piano. In 2012, my parents built a new home and put a new piano in it. I grew up on the old family piano. I was actually out of the state when they built that house, and I didn't have my own home. So my sister ended up with it, but that's okay. I'm going to fight over the new piano. Great grandma's pearls, you know, jewelry was mentioned earlier. And of course, you know, the namesake of our presentation is grandma's yellow pie plate. So what do all these things have in common? Aside from being non-titled property? Why would they be valued by family? And again, you can put your answer in the chat. Sentimental reasons, all of them, sentimental. But in addition to being sentimental, some of them actually have real world value too. There you guys, you're ahead of me. Karen mentions money. The family piano, maybe not as valuable. In fact, even though we didn't end up with the family piano, we still found one for free on Craigslist. And so we have a piano in the house now. But Dad's coins, a lot of money tied up in those, a lot of value tied to any single coin. Grandma's pearls, I guess to an extent, you could have put Grandpa's belt buckle in there too. But yeah, it really complicates things when things become sentimental, but also have real world value as well. And so we'll talk a little bit about how we can deal with that. So this is a slide where we cover today's presentation. I know we're already like 20 minutes in and you're thinking, no, you're just now telling me this is what we're going to be talking about today. But you'll also notice, those of you who do have the manual, and if you don't have it, you can always purchase it from our office after the matter too. Again, you don't need it to follow along today, but it is a good exercise if this is something you're serious about and would like to plan immediately. But the chapters align with the things we're going to be talking about today. And of course, number one, understand the sensitivity of transferring personal property. Well, chapter 1 in our manual is talking about personal property and so on and so forth. So you can follow along, but again, you're not gonna be completely lost if you don't have that manual. So understand the sensitivity of transferring personal property. So what makes inheritance such a sensitive issue for families? And we kind of talked about this in our unique and common challenges slide already, right? The denial of mortality, either your own, you know, on the part of the planner, or others on the part of the beneficiaries. Family secrets may be disclosed. I'd like to think these are extreme cases where there's some deep-rooted or deep-seated family issues that have not been shared with the whole family. I will say my predecessor, he grew up in the funeral industry. So like his dad owned a couple funeral homes. And so when he gave his presentation, and I have his notes here, and all throughout it, he says, tell this story, tell that story. And obviously I don't know what stories he's talking about. So I apologize, I don't have more stories, but there are some where family secrets were disclosed, things that weren't commonly known amongst other family members. So those secrets could be a deterrent in planning, particularly on the part of the person holding those secrets. Potential for conflict. I don't think it takes any stretch of the imagination to see how this would be an issue. You know, Karen mentioned the family farm. being a desirable asset that they need to kind of plan for. You know, my mom grew up here in Caldwell. Her maiden name is Saxton. Grew up on the fruit ranch there, the Saxton Fruit Farm. When my grandfather passed away, and then my great grandfather, lots of conflict. Not because he didn't have a will, but because things weren't detailed enough. A lot of things weren't taken into consideration, and that conflict boiled over into family strains that still exist today. So lots of potential for conflict. So, of course, I have to try not to inundate everybody with just bullet points and words, like to include some gifts. Side tangent here. I love Lucille Ball and Ricky Ricardo. They pioneered the concept of reruns. In fact, they own their own reruns and so profited from that. But I digress. Really interesting story, though, if you care to hear about it. All right. There is the fear factor, which I think kind of goes back to the denial of mortality. And honestly, it really plays into everything listed above this bullet point here. But in addition to that, there's also, you know, the fear of greedy receivers, people who maybe want those non-titled assets that do have monetary value strictly for the monetary value. One of the old administrative assistants here in my office, back when I first started working here, was telling a story of how she has a couple daughters. In fact, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to that story here in a second. Fear of unreceptive families. You might hear the term, I don't have room for anything, mother. We already have a full house. It's just not something I would use. So now going back to this administrative assistant, she would talk about how she has two daughters. One was unreceptive when it came to family inheritance. So like her jewelry in particular was the example that she used. One daughter just didn't really see a need for it, didn't have room for it. It wasn't really receptive. And the other daughter wanted it, but not for the sentimental reasons, more so for the money reasons. And so she kind of saw both these cases in just two of her daughters, which kind of goes to greedy receivers and keepsakes being sold, kind of tie into each other as well. And then the fear that motives will be questioned. I like to think my family's not afraid of that, but at the same time, I'm one of 5 kids. My sister is the only daughter in the family. So as you can imagine, my mom and sister have a really tight-knit relationship. If things came down in inheritance where she received more, then it would be that last bullet for sure. Motives would be questioned. But again, learning from past family experiences, I would hope that me and my siblings would be a little more flexible. So determine what you want to accomplish. So again, this goes along with the manual. This would be chapter 2 as we dive into it. So there's 5 common goals for family planning inheritance. And this doesn't mean that has to be your goals, just 5 common ones you can add to or take away as you would, as you please. So number 1 would be maintain privacy. And as we get into the more technical side, wills versus trusts, one of those maintains privacy a lot better than the other. So we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Protect or improve family relationships. Again, you know, thinking back to my own family and my mother in particular, has she's seen her relationships with her sisters deteriorate over the past couple decades. I would imagine that her top priority more than anything would be to preserve family relationships, that she could rest easy someday knowing that her sons and her daughter are still in good speaking terms and are still a major part of each other's lives. So for me and my family, I know that's a major goal. To be fair to all involved, we'll talk about that here a little bit. Fair and equitable don't always add up. Preserving memories and contributing to society. And I always had to put a plug in here because I talk about this guy quite a bit when I go into junior highs and do some guest teaching. I talk about how to live like a millionaire, and really just takes like frugal living, saving, and investing early. And this guy here, his name is Ronald Reed, and he did just that. And not only did he do it, he did it on a janitor's wages. So he was a janitor for his last job of his career. Prior to that, he was like a gas station attendant slash mechanic. But he followed those steps of frugal living, saving, investing to the point when he passed away, he had, I believe, $6 million of net worth, mostly tied up in stocks and bonds and other investments. And what he did when he passed away, well, first of all, no one knew that he had that much money. And when he passed away, he ended up leaving most of it to a local hospital and a local library as well. So he left a pretty strong legacy there and contributed to society in that way, so much so that, here I am talking about him 8 years after his passing on the complete opposite side of the country. So, and then consider who is involved in the goal setting. Again, we kind of mentioned previously our in-laws expected to attend the goal setting discussion, stepchildren, so on and so forth. So, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be talking about what fair means, and does fair always mean equitable? No, in fact, that's going to differ from family to family. So there are two common transfer approaches. There's the equality, that is treating everyone the same. So going back to that first slide where we talk about just divide my possessions equally. Does it work for everyone? No, works pretty well for title property, but maybe some people will take it even as far as to go and implement it for their non-title property as well. So that would mean equal number of items or equal value or equal chance to purchase. So equal chance to purchase, and this is kind of where I miss being in person, because we can hear ideas from everyone else, and we still can. So if you want to share ideas of how you've seen goods divided among beneficiaries, please feel free to type those into the chat box, or unmute and share them aloud if you want. But some ideas that I've heard of, there's drawing straws. So whoever gets the short straw, I guess, in this situation, typically that's a bad thing, but in this situation they would get to choose first, or they would get first dibs. There's also the fake monopoly money, where certain money or amount is allotted to each beneficiary, and they can go through the house and lay it down on whatever item they want, and once their money's gone, it's gone, and they take those items that they were able to purchase with their fake money. So I will say, as I mentioned previously, I grew up playing piano, and there's just nothing fancy about our piano in my home growing up, just a normal, I don't even know what it was called. My sister got it, which is fine, because my parents went and got a grand piano, one of the ones that plays itself. And I will say that if we ever did like the fake monopoly money, which I think my parents have tossed that idea around, I would probably blow it all on that piano. I don't know where it'll fit in my house, but I love that piano, and I can consistently bug my parents that I'm calling dibs on it. So if they go the equality way or even the equitable way, I feel like I stand a pretty good chance with their new piano. So that's equality. And then there's equitable. And so John mentioned this earlier, mental conditions and needs of other children. Well, that's taking the differences into account, right? So that would be like needs, or even personal characteristics such as birth order, gender, financial situation, or biological. When I say biological, we're talking about stepchildren, right? That's something that we would need to take into consideration. So another personal characteristic, and again, going back to Karen and my experience in working with ag operators and family operations when it comes to estate planning and succession planning, things get really complicated there when one or two kids stay behind to take on the family farm, and then the other kids go on to work in the public sector. So that's another personal characteristic, I guess, would be life decisions. What decisions did they make when it came to sticking with the family farm, or not even just that, maybe helping with mom more than the others. So to give an example of this, my grandmother passed away in May of 2020, shortly after the pandemic started. She has 7 daughters. So it's my mom and 6 sisters. Again, I apologize if I keep talking about, my mom's side of the family. But, one aunt I've never met. She lives in England. She stays over there, didn't even come back for the funeral. One aunt's estranged due to the family farm issues. And then the other sisters are all pretty close knit, as sisters are. But one of the aunts in particular was over at my grandmother's house at least every other day, if not every day, just taking care of her, taking her to her appointments. Was just really close with grandma. And when grandma passed away, she didn't have a whole lot because the estate planning thing, when her husband and her father-in-law passed away, didn't go too smoothly. But what she did have, she divided among her daughters and somewhat to her grandkids. But what she ended up doing is leaving the house to the daughter that took care of her. Now, that created some hard feelings among my aunts. And it's not necessarily because she didn't deserve it. It was because it wasn't communicated earlier. And we're going to talk about that here shortly. The aunt did work harder in taking care of mom than the others. The aunt, her husband had recently had a stroke, and so he was unemployed, even though he wasn't. He had a successful career prior to that, but was no longer to work after that stroke, and so financially speaking, probably needed more than the other siblings as well. All those things grandma took into consideration, and did it come out equitable? That's debatable. Probably would have been more accepted if it would have been talked about earlier. So another example of how we can, people can talk about these things earlier. Here's a scenario, and I'm going to, give you a heads up right now. I'm going to ask for participation in chat. 3 siblings all want the same Winnie the Pooh book that was read to all of them when they were kids. So the oldest is a daughter. She's divorced, no kids from the first marriage, but remarried, married into a family who already has 2 kids. So she now has 2 step kids that she's raising. The middle daughter is single, no kids. And the youngest son is married with 1 child. They all want the Winnie the Pooh book. Obviously, it's strictly sentimental, not valuable. Which of the kids do you think should receive the Winnie the Pooh book? Go ahead and type it into the chat box. Is it the oldest? Is it the middle? Is it the youngest? You're welcome to share your reasoning, or you can just simply choose one of the 3. Give everyone a minute to respond. All right. Got some ideas here. All right, 4 responses so far. Give you about 10 more seconds if you want to reply. And again, there's no right or wrong answer here. Every family is different. You have someone who wants to say something? No? Okay. So we see a few voting for the youngest and then a few saying draw lots, draw straws. And again, I'm not going to tell you the right or wrong answer. It's all personal opinion. I would say the youngest son, but then again, I'm also the youngest in my family, so I'm probably a little biased there. So these are things that will need to be considered, though. As we mentioned earlier, there's some unique challenges, the stepkids, and we see an example of that here. Or maybe the middle daughter still plans to have a family someday, so on and so forth. All right, we'll go ahead and continue on. And again, I want to remind everyone you can post questions at any time, and we'll discuss them. All right, determining what fair means, establishing a fair process. So again, you'll find this in the manual if you have it, but a fair process is specific. So again, going back to personal experience with my family and the family farm, I think the major point in which things broke down is that things were not specific enough. I think my grandfather or great-grandfather had a lot of trust that the family would not fight, that they would do things in the best interests of the farm, and they didn't really give any specifics to ensure that that was actually carried out, because it wasn't. Moral and ethical. So Obviously, we don't want to play favorites. I'm sure it happens, but if there are favorites played, then you could definitely take issue with the moral and ethical portion of the will or trust. Equal input. So that kind of ties into the moral and ethical part. Was the plan made with everybody's feedback? In our estate planning class with the ag operators and family farms, we always encourage the families to have those meetings ASAP, to call meetings with the family. And again, family can mean whatever you want to mean. It can mean in-laws, it can mean just the kids. But whatever it is, figure out who's going to be at that table and then invite them to that table soon. So you can lay these things out earlier rather than later. And of course, do it with equal input so you don't have any kind of backlash or fallout after the planner's passing. Consistent rules. And then representative subgroups. And so this kind of goes back to the in-laws portion, right? I think, spouses that have married into the family could constitute as subgroups in this situation. And so again, are they going to represent themselves, or are their spouses going to represent them as their family and as the couple? So how can we, well, obviously, when is a process judged unfair? Well, when it's not specific, when it's not moral or ethical, when there's not equal input. And of course, that's the cop-out answer of when it's judged unfair. So getting a little more detailed, it's unfair or unspecific when it lacks accuracy. It's unmoral or unethical when those standards are not followed. Okay, that one, kind of a cop-out answer. It's not fair when not everyone's voice has a decision. So, maybe they're at the table, maybe they're not valued as much as others, or maybe they're not as loud as others. I think we all have that one sibling or family member who can easily dominate a conversation, right? And so it's not necessarily equal input. It could mean equal voice. All right, and we do have a question here. How should one decide when an adult child has no management skills, or if a child has long-term addiction issues? There seems to be more potential reasons now to not equally divide their inheritance. And that's exactly right. We are talking about equitable versus equal. They don't mean the same things. And if I'm being honest, those are conversations and hard conversations that you will have to have, where you will point back at past decisions that they've made. And because of those decisions, these are the decisions that I'm making. This does not reflect on my feelings for you. I still love you as a child, but I'm using that but is kind of a risky move. There's a book called Crucial Conversations, very popular book. I had to read it as a communications minor, but it walks you through those hard conversations and how to have them effectively. And one of the things they say is don't use that conjunction but, because as soon as you use that word, the only thing they remember is everything that comes after that. So, you have to have that conversation. You have to plan for it accordingly. Maybe study how to have that conversation, because there's a lot of potential to hurt feelings and strain relationships. But you can't just leave things equally, because there is just as good a potential, if not higher potential, that things will fall apart after your passing. So how should you decide? You should decide with your spouse. You should have that conversation at the table, maybe with a large doses of preparation put into it. I mean, your family better than I do. If there's a potential of one of your siblings opening their mouth, or one of your kids opening their mouth and offending the other sibling, then you would have to prepare and account for that. Maybe preemptively plan for that so it doesn't happen. So there are a lot of ways to talk about this, but there's really no right way. Again, this is going to be to the individual families and individuals in those families. But I would highly recommend that you make those decisions with your spouse, and that you act on those decisions one way or another. So I'm sorry if that's an open-ended question, but it's really hard to talk in specifics when basically the whole premise of our presentation today is it's up to you and your family. We're just giving you material to make these decisions on your own, because personal finance is personal. I say that all the time. And estate planning is also personal. So, all right. Consistent rules. Rules are not consistently followed. Again, not a super intuitive slide, I know. But basically, process is judged unfair when it's none of those things. So, and then consider informal contributions too. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier with, one of my aunts who got the house. It was an informal contribution that she was such a doting daughter to grandma, right? And again, financially speaking, she needed it more than the other aunts. And in my personal opinion, I think it worked out fine. She got compensated for informal contributions, and it seemed fair. But again, fair is in the eye of the beholder, and fair can take on different definitions or optics just based on conversations that can be had beforehand. So identify special objects to transfer. So avoid inaccurate assumptions by identifying items that have meaning. So what are some items that have meaning in your family? Actually, I think we already asked this and we talked about guns and goods. But if you do want to share some very specific items, please do. While you're typing those in, I could think of a few. Going back to my grandmother who passed away, the same one I'm talking about, who passed away in 2020. About 2 or 3 years before she passed, she moved out of her home, the one that my mom and aunts were raised in, and into a smaller house. But as she was moving out, she went through and asked all the grandkids what they remember about the house, or some sort of memory. And I remember telling my mom, who then relayed it to her, she had this toilet, which sounds really goofy, but she had this toilet that had two of the holes in the bottom, and I've never seen anyone like it. And I don't know the science behind it or why that was the case with this particular toilet in her bathroom, but that was just like a vivid memory I had at grandma's, that she had this really unique toilet. And so my grandma actually took a picture of the toilet, and I think I have it somewhere in my house, which sounds super goofy, but it was just one of those weird memories that I have about grandma's house, is that she had a lot of unique things. There was a creepy room downstairs that was dark and just full of really old toys. But I guess I chose to remember her unique bathroom above all else. Military uniform, interesting. That would be, a very sentimental item. And then if you've identified it now, that's great. So things that you might have made. So those things, I think about my brother. His Christmas tree is comprised entirely of crafts that his 4 kids have made for them. So none that they had bought over the years, just, the pipe cleaners, the popsicle sticks glued together, little pictures of, 8-year-old kids and all that. And so I don't know if they'll fight over that, but that is definitely sentimental to them. All right, sharing stories about meaning. So if you have the book, and one of my favorite parts about the manual is as you get deeper into the chapters, they have little anecdotes. I don't know if anecdotes is the right word, but they have little stories in the margins where people will talk about their experience, some good, some bad. In this particular chapter, it's mostly good, surprisingly. One of the stories talks about how when their grandfather passed away, they didn't immediately divide up his goods. What they did is they waited a few months, and at Thanksgiving, when they're together as a family, they pulled out all of the grandfather's goods, and the grandfather had assigned who gets what. And so they would read off his will, and they'd hand it to that individual, and the individual would receive that item. And upon receiving that item, they would tell the story of why that's important to them, the memory tied to that item. And the speaker or the person telling the story concluded that it was a very special day, and I'm glad we did that. So In addition to identifying those items, identify why is it important to yourself or to others. And again, going back to that story that I just talked about, celebrate a person's life when you share those stories about those memories. So basically, when it comes to identifying the special objects, like the worst thing that you can do is just have a free for all. Again, going back to the stories in my notes and in these manuals, there's another one in there where it talks about how immediately following the grandfather's funeral, they found a niece or a daughter or son-in-law, I can't remember, in the garage, just going through grandpa's stuff and starting to take it, right? And so really bad when there's not a plan, when there's not those boundaries set in place, things have the ability to really go off the rails real quick. So communicate those expectations way beforehand, identify those items way beforehand, not only identify, but identify the reasoning around them. Basically, this slide can be summed up by, communicate. So anybody know what movie this is from? 10 points if you can name it. I will say the very first time I presented this, it was in our conference room. I had my boss in attendance because he's supposed to evaluate one of our classes per year. And when I first put this slide in, I had not seen this movie. It's Cool Hand Luke. So if you mention that, you win. And during that first presentation, I openly admitted that I had not seen this movie, but I included the slide anyways. And then my boss in the back of the room starts to ridicule me for not seeing Cool Hand Luke. I have since remedied that. I did watch it. It was definitely a unique movie. Pretty enjoyable. So learn distribution options and their consequences. So this is where we get a little more technical. There's no perfect mode for transfer. Again, this is going to be up to your family and your situation. But there's the first one that we've mentioned here. When we say wills and trusts, well, there's wills. So wills name an executor. That's a person who's going to carry out the will. And they're very simple to make, but it requires probate. And what probate means is it actually has to go through court system, probate court. And since it goes through probate court, it becomes public record because everything that goes through the court is public record. So that would include your will. Now, truth be told, I don't have a will yet. I have life insurance, and for my situation in life, I guess that's good enough. But what details are shared in that will, I don't entirely know, to be honest. Maybe it just posts the will. Maybe it does share the details. I couldn't tell you for fact. On the other side, we have living trusts. Living trusts, it's easier to leave property in them. I will say, in addition to leaving property, living trust gives you the ability to make really specific guidelines with your inheritance. So again, going back to the succession planning that we do with the ag educators and ag operators, the sixth class of that series, we actually bring in a lawyer and he answers these type of questions in great detail. And it's pretty impressive what you can do with a trust, right? We had one example of an individual who was not married, was dating a girl, longtime girlfriend, lived with him in this house, had a lot of land, a large ranch, but he was not married to this girlfriend of his, but he wanted to take care of her, didn't really want to include her in a lot of the long-term value things. So what he ended up doing is establishing this trust that said upon his passing, she can live in the house until she passes or leaves, at which point the land in the house is then divided to his kids. And that was locked up tight. She couldn't change it. The kids couldn't change it. I'm sure he had some other specifics in his trust that made the land long-term viable for the farm, or in other words, made it very, very difficult for the kids to sell it for residential or anything other than farm use. So trust gives you lots of options. Obviously, if you can't tell the difference between when one would be good and the other, I would say living trust is pretty applicable and beneficial to those who have a lot of assets or complex assets. So in addition to that, it does keep things private because it doesn't have to go through probate court. And it's not contestable. So as I mentioned earlier, that farmer or rancher who had all that land was able to establish it in such a way that nobody could change it, right? So both methods allow you to name beneficiaries. So, who does it go to first? Who does it go to second? So on and so forth. I do want to put a plug in here because I've talked to my own parents about this, and their financial advisor told them to always go with a will, don't go with a trust, right? And I asked them, why would he say that? And my parents said, I don't know. And they went as far as say, I don't even know if he knows why he said that. And so I want to point out here that this is not something that you should take a financial advisor's advice on. Yeah, they might know your finances, but they don't know your family life. This is typically something if you feel necessary to consult with a lawyer on. Will that cost you money? More than likely. Will setting up a trust, which might sound more appealing for the time being. One thing I did not put in here is, yeah, it probably costs more money too. But if you have enough assets, if you are concerned enough about your family relationships and not straining them, then consulting with a lawyer is not a bad idea. They can lead you to the best course of action based upon your specific goals and desires that we've talked about previously. So another recommendation when it comes to this technical stuff is to keep a separate list. And what a separate list is, it's basically just that. It's a separate list. It's not necessarily written into the will or the trust. It's something that you can keep on hand and then refer to it in your will or trust. And what it is it's a document that you can just update regularly, where you say this person gets this and this person gets this. Basically, it's a way to avoid going back to your will over and over and over to update it, or your trust for that matter. When it comes to separate lists, there's, and one reason we're talking fairly vague in today's presentation is because estate laws will differ from state to state. In Idaho specifically, your separate list has to be a holographic will. And what a holographic will is, it means it has to be handwritten. I don't know how they came up with that definition, holographic meaning handwritten, but it has to be handwritten, and that's pretty much it. Right now, when we say handwritten, I don't know if that means like hand signed. Some of it has to be handwritten, because like here's an example of what a list would look like. A separate list would look like. This is the list that I referred to in my last will and testament. Therefore, please distribute the items listed below to the person I have named. So you have a list of items, you have to be distributed to, and then you have my signature and the date. So again, not entirely sure if all of this would have to be written by hand or just the signature. That being said, I suppose the intentions behind a holographic will is to make things harder to fake. Why am I struggling on the word? Plagiarize, I guess, is another way of thinking it. So make it harder to plagiarize or to falsify, because I guess anyone can type up these things on a Word document and say, look what I found from Grandpa. So being handwritten is making it a little bit more difficult. I would say not foolproof, but something's better than nothing. So that's pretty much it in terms of the technical portion. We'll go ahead and move into the managing conflicts if they arise. And again, hopefully, planning helps, because the old adage of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I'm convinced that there's never a more applicable situation than when it comes to estate planning. You can do a lot to prevent conflict by just planning ahead and sorting these things out beforehand. So sources and solution. Well, first, let's talk about the sources. 4 common sources would be the lack of communication. Again, I feel like I keep going back to that, but probably can't be overstated. A different attitude, beliefs, or values. We already had a few comments in the chat where it's asking about, well, one kid doesn't have, management abilities. One kid might have addiction issues. All these would kind of tie into the attitudes, beliefs, and values portion. So yes, these are going to be sources of conflict. We'll talk about how to address those or ideas to address those here in a bit. 3 different expectations about roles. And this can kind of go back to those informal contributions as well. I mean, again, in conversations that I've had with my sister, I think she has this expectation that once mom and dad become too old to take care of themselves, that she's going to start playing that role of primary caregiver, which is great. She's the only sister. She has that motherly nature that me and my brothers lack. So she's going to have that role, but then what expectations are tied to it when it comes to the inheritance? It's not a conversation that we've had yet, but having taught this is something that I intend to talk about someday when we have our own meeting as siblings and mom and dad. And then unresolved prior conflict, which may or may not be an issue with your family. From personal experience, I find the more competitive the siblings, the more conflict there is. I have, like I mentioned, 4 siblings, my 2 oldest brothers, really passive guys, but me, my sister, and my brother just above me, really competitive. So might be some issues there that we haven't resolved because of that competitiveness. And family business, because my dad did end up hiring my brother and brother-in-law. So they work at the same company now. So 4 possible solutions. Communicate and be transparent in word and action. So I think we've talked about that communication in word, and transparency in word, but your actions have to line up with those words, right? If you're giving more money to one kid more often than the other. I see this in extended family. My wife's grandfather remarried, and so it's your, mine, and ours family now. Remarried later in life, so even though they're all adult kids, it does seem like one side of the family gets more help than the other side of the family. Hard to say how that's going to play out, but it doesn't feel super transparent in action, at least. And so that does tend to lead to some of these conflicts here on the left side. Respect the property owner's rights. So when it comes down to it, who has the final say so, right? It's going to be the planner. It's going to be mom or dad, grandma and grandpa, right? And if they want something, whether it be right or wrong in your own opinion, ultimately what it comes down to is their say so, and you'd have to respect their rights, even if it would be a hard pill to swallow. But again, hopefully, we can rely more on solution number 1 of communication, so that we don't have to just swallow large pills that we don't want to instead. Number 3, agree to disagree. So again, I look back on my own family, and I apologize if I keep referring to my own family, but ultimately I am preparing myself to agree to disagree, to put family first, put relationships first, and understand that everything after that's materialistic, and that mom and dad would not want family conflict. That above all else, they want us to love one another when all is said and done. And if that means agreeing to disagree to maintain those relationships, and so be it. And if necessary, involve a mediator or third party. I don't know if this would be a last resort, but it's definitely something worth considering if things are starting to get out of hand. Looking back, I had the family farm, included a third party or mediator. And again, that's a big if, because all parties involved would have to be open to that idea. But had they done that, would things have turned out differently? It's hard to say. but I would like to think so. So, and I think with that, we are concluded. Are there any questions that want to be posted right now? We've taken up about an hour. I know I was on the clock for an hour and a half, but I wanted that half-hour wiggle room for questions or questions that arose in the middle. So we have the time. And I am open to any questions that you do have. And you can unmute and ask them, or you can simply type them into the chat box. So if you did not get this manual, but you would like it, you can buy it for $10, I believe, through the marketplace that was set up by my office. And Kathy, do you still have that link? It was part of the registration.
Yes, it should be part of the registration that you all received. The link should be there.
Okay. And right now I'll go out and talk to my office assistants and make sure that remains open for the time being. So if you are interested, you can go back to the registration link and purchase this book. It's $10 and then we'll just ship it to you for free. So if that is a resource that you want, it walks you through step by step all these things in much more detail than we've covered in this 1 hour. So a lot of text. They've got some activities here where you will actually write in some answers that could hopefully help you plan and prepare more accordingly. So if you have questions, my name, my email, and my office phone number is right there for you. So yeah, I'm happy to field those now or later. If you are interested, and I know we at least have one listener here who has a family farm on hand. If you are interested in the farm succession plan, we cover, again, it's a 6-week series. We run it once a year. We ran it in February and March. I do it with about 3 other educators from across the state of Idaho. But if you're interested in attending that, please send me an email and I will get you in contact with our ag educators who run the registration for that. So.
I have a question.
I'll turn it back over to Kathy.
You know what we do? There is a question, actually. I think it's Sharon.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew, for teaching this class. I have a question regarding how do you find the value of like antiques or coins or whatever? I mean, do you have any resources? What would you suggest?
Yeah, that's a good question. Initially, I don't have like a one size fits all resources. I mean, if you can see a theme developing in our presentation here, it's that I don't have a single answer for anything, it seems like. But if it comes to antiques, if it comes to coins, the internet obviously is a very valuable resource. You can Google just about anything and find what people are willing to pay for it, either on eBay or some sort of forum, or even, high probability that there's a group out there that, just gets together and collects these things and talks about these things. You mentioned coins. My dad has a lot of books that talk about the value of coins. He can also go into coin shops and talk about value with that guy there, albeit he says that guy tends to undervalue things, probably because that's the only what he wants to pay for it, right? So I will say, if you go into like antique shops, take those with a grain of salt. Like if you go to like brick and mortar places with in-house experts, people who are willing to buy those things, again, take it with a grain of salt, because they're willing to buy it at that price and want to buy it for probably less than what it's worth. So I would, if I were you, I'd probably rely on the internet, get pretty good at Google searches, but if nothing else, internet can lead you to addresses where you can find experts in that area. Or we could just cross our fingers that the Antique Roadshow comes along to Boise.
I think I saw it is coming to Boise, Andrew.
It is coming to Boise. There you go. There's the answer. Antique Roadshow. They've got an expert for seemingly everything there. All right, and I see a comment from Karen that you're interested in the attending the family farm one. Email me. We had a great educator. Her passion was farm succession. Unfortunately, she left for Kansas State to be a director of farming succession and the extension system over there. But the other educators that helped me out with that are still around. It's really cool because we also do like those personality tests, the yellow, blue, white, red, because personalities play a large part into, not just, farm succession, but, all families in general. So understanding those personalities, and I guess I would recommend that too. I mean, it could be a fun little tidbit that you add to these conversations that you're going to have with your families, is take one of those personality tests. And as you come to the table, you can kind of talk about it, kind of laugh, because usually you can see it once you read those personality traits and what their results are. You laugh and say, yeah, that makes sense. And with that context, it could help in the planning process. And at least that's the goal for the farm succession one. But then we do get a little more technical with, what's retirement look like in the ag industry, and cost basis and stuff like that. So, all right, got another one. All right, so this is a story. So when John's aunt passed, had about 200 silver dollars in a collection, various values that seemed very complicated to try and figure out all the values. So we agreed to dump them all in a bowl, and then we just pick out one at a time by all the heirs, and we got what we got without being too complicated. That's interesting. I'm sorry. So yeah, and we're getting off on tangents here. I guess if you don't have any questions, you're welcome to leave. But going back to coins, my dad has gotten into it in probably the past 10, 15 years. He specifically collects Carson City silver dollars. And it's kind of interesting. Maybe I'm just saying it's interesting because I want to inherit his coins. But it's interesting because he can tell me, all right, it was made in this year. They only minted this number of coins in this year. And then there's a whole like quality aspect that goes into coins, right? And I don't want to say like your idea was bad, John, but one of the things that goes into valuing a coin is the quality. And the more dinged up it gets, the more, rubbing that it gets on the face, the less detail you see, the less valuable it is. And one of the reasons that it's really hard to find a very good coin in a very good condition is because as soon as they're minted, they put them in like these 50-pound bags. And so like the minute they're made, they go into an abrasive situation where they're being dinged up and eroded. And so I guess by putting them in a bowl and mixing up, you did that too. But then again, if they're not already encased, then I guess that means they are probably of the highest quality. But yeah, that's one way to do it. My dad has the most valuable ones in books or cases. So if we didn't want to complicate matters, we could probably take out like the highest end ones and then just shuffle up the rest and then hand it off, draw them out just like you did. So, all right. So someone has a resource here for China and flatware values. That's good to know. Cool. I might use that. I bought some fine silverware, not fine, off an auction some time ago, and I have struggled to find the value. So I just pulled that link up myself. All right. Well, is there anything else? No sense in keeping you longer.
If there's nothing else, you all have Andrew's email right there and phone number. So we just want to thank you, Andrew. You always provide such a high quality educational experience. So we really appreciate it. I loved hearing the stories about your family. It's very relatable to what we're all kind of going through. And so I just want to say thank you on behalf of NKA.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy, and thanks everyone for attending. I will keep an eye out for any questions or inquiries.
Okay. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.